Welcome to the History Nerd and I podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Michelle Young in her book, The Art Spy. Different type of spy book, but still great. I had such a good time talking to Michelle. Super easy to talk to. And a story that I haven't read anywhere else. Really interesting stuff about the Nazis when it came to art and stuff. You may have seen The Monuments Men. It's kind of an offshoot of that, but true story. It's amazing. How about I shut up and we let Michelle tell you about it? Let's do it. And here we are with author Michelle Young, The Art Spy, the extraordinary untold tale of World War II resistance hero Rose Valland. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listen, before we jump into the book, I do keep up on current events. You and Untapped New York just won an award for podcasting. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. That was really exciting. It's a podcast just about New York secrets, and it's really just a creative outlet for me to explore the weird questions that pop into my head. So our latest episode, for example, is titled, Why is the FDR Drive Purple? And that is an elevated highway in New York City that suddenly became all purple a few years ago. And there are lots of myths that abound about it. And I decided it's time to find out the real reason. And you'll hear it on the podcast.
As somebody who grew up just outside, there's a lot of weird things that you can go over. You've got content for decades to go through.
Oh, yeah. Endless.
I also appreciate you mentioning in your post about it that you don't do podcasting for money. I love answering the questions. How's the podcast going? It's great. You're making any money? Absolutely not. If you get into it for that, you're going to be very disappointed, most likely.
Yeah, that and online advertising these days, it's partial cents for, 1,000 views at best. So none of this, unless you are, in the millions and millions and millions of downloads, is going to make anyone any money.
I don't think I'm going to be Joe Rogan anytime soon, but that's okay. Let's get focused, though. That's not why we're here. The Art Spy, Rose Valland. Okay. Where did you actually first hear Rose's story? When did she kind of come into your life?
Well, my husband is French, for better or worse. And once we started dating, I decided to dig deep into World War II history, France. My family actually has a tie to World War II because my grandfather, as a Taiwanese citizen, actually survived Hiroshima, the bombing of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. So I've always been interested in World War II, but got a chance to get into the European side of the story in the 2010s. So I read every World War II book I could really get my hands on, fell into a subgenre of female spy World War II books, discovered it's a pretty robust genre, popular genre. And I actually at one point took a break from that and read a book called Goring's Man in Paris by Jonathan Petropoulos. He is a looted art expert, academic, and he wrote a whole book about Hermann Goring's right-hand man in Paris who helped him source art. Petropoulos actually knew this Nazi. His name was Bruno Lose. And in his book, every few chapters, a woman named Rose Valland appeared. And she was a resistance spy. And I said, I can't believe I've never heard of this female spy. Since I've read the books about them, I've read the compilation books about them, and she didn't appear anywhere. And this, we can talk about more, is pretty shocking. And so I quickly looked her up, saw that there hadn't been definitely an English book about her and not too much written about her even in her home country in France. So that is what kickstarted me thinking about writing a book about Rose. And my first stop was to show up in her hometown uninvited.
Well, on top of being a writer, you also know art, right? Like this is not something that's entirely new to you. What's your background in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied art history at Harvard as an undergrad. And before that, I had taken years of studio art just for fun, but with a great teacher out on Long Island. And she really introduced me to all styles of art, really got me passionate about it. So from AP art history in high school, went to studied art history in college, and then didn't do too much with it after college. I worked in the fashion industry and then became a journalist and an entrepreneur. And so this book really allowed me to dig back into an early passion and finally use it for once. So that was exciting.
I have to feel like Harvard's a really good place to learn about art because there's all sorts of fancy people. It's probably like, oh yeah, here's my Degas right here. I said that right? Just making sure.
Yes, and actually the local museum that's at Harvard, the Fogg Museum, has some really exceptional paintings, impressionist and all sorts of genres. A world-class art museum right in Cambridge.
So you were primed for this when you get to go back to it. Where does Rose start? We actually should, right? So we have your background. What's kind of Rose's background? Because on top of, the whole France thing and everything, she is, and this is not a spoiler, people, she's a lesbian too, which, once again, the Nazis hated a lot of people. Gay people were also on their list. So can you tell a little bit about her?
Yes. So Rose Valland, as the world knows her, she is an art historian who worked in the Jeu de Paume Museum, which the Nazis had taken over to loot Jewish-owned art collections through. But prior to her arrival in Paris, she comes from a town called Saint-Étienne de Saint-Joire. It's about 40 minutes southeast of Lyon in France. It's a small town, and she is the daughter of a blacksmith and comes from a family of mechanics, wheelwrights, working class. And she displays an early aptitude for school and the arts. And so her mother really diligently tries to send her through scholarships to the best schools she can. So after primary school, she goes to a boarding school, then gets shipped off to another school in Grenoble for high school, which is known as the Teachers College. And there we start to see, at least the records we have, of her watercolors, her drawings, her paintings. And then after this, she is accepted into the École des Beaux-Arts in Lyon, a very good art school. So she's there in what is the equivalent of college for us. And then following that, she wins a host of awards there, is very successful, and then is accepted to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And this is sort of the pinnacle of arts education in France. If you want to be an artist or even a teacher of art, this is the school you go to, because Fragonard, Degas, all the painters that you've heard of attended school there. Except for, I believe, I think Picasso didn't get in.
Now, here's a question. How often do you actually have to ask your husband, how do I pronounce this? Because I would have butchered everything you just said if I tried to do it myself.
I know. Actually, the funny thing about French is that I think it's very similar to Chinese. And stick with me here.
I feel like that's not true at all, Michelle, but I am intrigued as to how you're going to try and connect this.
So in the Asian languages, especially Mandarin, if you pronounce something wrong, it means something totally different. There's like 4 ways to say the word ma. And if you say ma versus ma, it's a totally different word. It's horse or it's mom, right? And in French, I found that it's very similar. If you don't pronounce it exactly right, the French stare at you as if they have no idea what you're saying. And I discovered this was not just random people. It would be like my in-laws. It'd be people I was friends with. And I realized that if I did not pronounce it exactly right, I would not be understood. So I've spent, now over 15 years perfecting the accent at the expense of a fluency of the language, but it gives people a sense, oh, she knows how to speak French. So my pronunciation is good, but the translations, I always, of course, had to have him verify.
Lady history nerd, she was actually born in Paris, but only lived there for a year. But she gets very smug whenever I ruin anything French. She gets very all up in it. She's going to yell at me when she hears this, but that's okay. We'll fight through it. So Rose is going to have the normal problems of a woman at this time period, right? So, she's not working at the Louvre. Where is she working? What's kind of her work life? What I really want to get to is, why is our girl not getting paid for most of this book?
Excellent question. So, Rose is an outsider. She doesn't come from Paris. And there's a phrase in France, it's Paris and the rest of the country. They don't consider anyone to be an upstanding citizen if you're not from Paris, right? And so she's fighting that. She is a lesbian. She's not out in her younger years, but she's definitely not your smirking, femininely dressed female trying to get a job in art history, right, as a curator. And then she manages to also piss off the man who's in charge of the Louvre, also in charge of the École du Louvre, a school she eventually goes to, and he gives her a really bad review on her thesis. And this kind of signals you won't get a job at the Louvre, where I am also in charge. And so she goes knocking on all sorts of different doors. We see in her papers, she applies everywhere, finally gets a job at this museum called the Jeu de Paume. And it is a museum dedicated to the international schools of modern art. And so they curate, for example, here's the modern art coming out of Spain. Here's the modern art coming out of Germany. And it's really disdained by the institutionalists at this point. Who wants to talk about modern art when you have the Mona Lisa and all sorts of other history paintings that represent, France's colonial history, imperial history, let's say. So she takes this job unpaid as a secretary. So this is not even an arts job. This is typing and writing out letters, and we don't know exactly the timeline, but we know that she also does some editing work for the curator at that museum for his personal arts magazine. So whether the magazine came first or the job, we don't know for sure, but he does help her out and hires her. But this job is unpaid, and it's basically impossible to go from a secretary to a curator job. And, the French society and French civil service, it's still pretty similar to this day. I interviewed people to understand the rigidity of this system, and they explained exactly this. If you want to go from secretary to curator, good luck. So she campaigns and campaigns, and obviously she's doing the work of a curator. Her boss is a very front-facing man, so he's traveling around the world. He's trying to get new exhibitions and cater to artists that he wants to feature. So he's often not there, and then if he's not traveling, he's out sick because he's got an angina problem. He's got a host of health issues. And so she's running the show on her own and campaigning to get paid, campaigning to become an unpaid curator, which would be the next step for her, a lateral move. And it takes her many years, I think over 4 years to get this. And then once she's an unpaid curator, it would take another 4 years to become paid, if at all. So for at least 7-8 years, if not, she's unpaid.
I mean, she was probably more likely to get paid by the Nazis than the actual French people in charge of these museums. I don't know if that's historically true, but you can't prove otherwise, I think, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that the Germans are straightforward and by the book, so
maybe. There's the movie Monuments Men, and there's things around this, but what I really think you did rather exceptionally here, because, and we'll talk about this, Rose is a sphinx in a lot of ways, where you have to, as the author, kind of fill in everything around her, because one of the things that made her very good at this was she kept her head down and just kept doing her thing. But what I really, really learned a lot with was the Nazis and art. They really were just maniacs in more than one way, obviously, but they were fanatical about art and very specific art. And can you tell me a little bit just how, we talked about the French didn't like modern art at that point. With the Nazis, it was a thing, right?
Oh, yeah. So we should talk a little bit about Hitler then. He was an aspiring artist, aspiring architect as well, and he had been rejected from the Vienna School of Art there. And this kind of begins his trajectory and hatred, and where he begins to define his anti-Semitism. He starts to imagine that there's like a Viennese Jewish cabal that has prevented him from achieving his dreams of becoming an artist. So from his rejection at school to other things that happened to him while in Vienna.
But just to be clear, he just sucked at everything. So that's...
Yes, his paintings are boring.
I have seen them, and you're just kind of like, well, you just suck. There's nobody keeping you down. It's just, you're not good at this. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, precisely. And so he believed first that Germany was going through a cultural decline, and that was driven by these movements in modernity. So in art, in painting, in literature, all across the board. And he believed that he was the arbiter of what was great German art. And so he gave modern art a great new moniker. It was called Entarrte Kunst, which means degenerate art, and curated exhibitions by pulling so-called degenerate art out of museums in Germany and showing them to the public and shaming the curators who had purchased these. And he also had given the German art curators and museum heads 4 years to get rid of degenerate art. And those who didn't then were subsequently either, expelled from the Nazi Party or shamed. And what he believed to be great German art and architecture was things from the old masters, as well as neoclassical architecture, which kind of morphed later into kind of a neoclassic fascist style. And everything else should not be considered art and preferably should be destroyed and burned. And he was a voracious collector. And so pretty much everyone else under him followed suit and wanted to emulate and collect art. And some actually even surpassed his voraciousness, like Hermann Göring. And they filled their houses and train cars and such with art and were searching for it all over the occupied countries.
Something else you highlight here, which I think is super important to kind of go over, there was still that very German hierarchy, which means Göring himself couldn't just walk in and just decide what he wanted, right? Which I think when we think of anything we've seen World War II, especially with movies, it's the Nazi is here, he gets to do whatever he wants because everyone's scared of him. But it was a bit different, especially in this circumstance.
Yeah, that was one of the really interesting things that I came across, just looking at decrees after decrees and the wording and how they really needed to justify the taking of art, and everything had to be on paper legal, and also the hierarchy you mentioned. And so, first they said, we just need to safeguard the art. This is a safeguarding for a future peace treaty. And so when France capitulated, that armistice was just considered literally that, an armistice that's a temporary truce, and that eventually when Britain surrendered, which they believed was inevitable, that there would be a new peace treaty for these allied countries. And at that point, they would figure out their war reparations, and art would be part of it. And so they were very careful to never mention that they were going to take any paintings at first, not to bring anything back to Germany, no exporting. And then within the hierarchy, Hermann Göring wanted to take everything. He came to the Jeu de Paume many, many times, but he figured out a workaround which would still please Hitler and allow him to take a whole bunch of stuff. He wrote his own decree, and it came out and said, here are the 5 priority categories. Hitler's first, then me, then party comrade Alfred Rosenberg, then I think it was the museums, and then finally like war orphans and wives or something like this.
How nice of them. How nice of them to remember the war orphans and wives.
There were so many disputes between the Germans and the hierarchies about what art could be taken, and they were fighting amongst each other throughout the whole war. There was Hermann Göring in the Air Force, there was the Army, there were so many organizations who came to France to try to steal its art, and some were more successful than others.
Now, were there any good Germans? Was there anybody who within this system was trying to save art, trying to kind of at least do the right thing under horrible circumstances, or all bad guys, screw them?
No, there definitely were. I read a memoir that was somewhat useful in the book, and he claimed that he didn't know anything about the art looting that was happening in the Jeu de Paume with where Rose was, and that he had been horrified to hear these things, and he had done his utmost. Within the museum where Rose worked, there were art historians who had been sent from Germany, PhDs in art history, who believed that their work was just for preservation and cataloging, and they believed that they were doing a good job. And some of them eventually did become rather horrified as they watched art get shipped out and Göring come and take stuff. And so some of them did express their concerns to Rose. Even one of them felt that anytime something happened in Germany, especially if it, bombs hit his hometown, he felt that it had been like retribution for what he was doing in the museum. So there were people that had misgivings, but it was obviously very difficult to even express any kind of discontent in this kind of regime.
Now, back to Rose. When we call her the art spy, is she at night going and shanking Nazis in the shadows? What makes her the art spy?
Right. So she is more of the information gatherer type of spy. So she's in the museum. She's documenting what people are saying, what art is coming in, which families has it been stolen from. She's stealing negatives. She's having them printed. And she's really preparing something for a future war tribunal where she can prove, and France could prove, that this widespread systematic theft had happened. We do see her occasionally going out into the Parisian field, and she's documenting where people live. And we kind of know that for sure she was there because she mentions it's like on the 3rd floor to the right. That's this person's apartment. Or there's observations of her saying Bruno Lohse took carpets and stuff them into a van in front of his apartment. So these kind of observations, we realize that she's also trying to figure things out outside of the workplace. But no, she's not murdering anyone. She's not.
That we know of. Maybe she didn't write it down, Michelle. That might be because I think you had a really tough job with Rose in this, because what you're talking about could really get her in trouble. Like, we don't want to, make this sound like, oh, it's not as exciting, because she is a lesbian. Her partner is living with her in France. If she brings attention to herself and anybody looks into anything, she is putting herself in danger. It's not like she was just sitting downstairs, like, as you talked about. She's walking around, she's putting herself in situations to get this information, but that can also put her in a really bad spot.
Yeah, and there's one moment where she gets caught, and she mentions, I was normally so careful. And she almost never wrote anything down while at the museum. She had a nearly photographic memory, so she would just reproduce things she saw when she got home. And she got caught kind of trying to decipher an address. And Bruno Loza, which was her main nemesis in this museum, a Nazi PhD art historian, told her, basically, the consequences if you were caught spying, you would be shot. And she responds, no one would take such a risk.
Except Rose would.
Except Rosewood. And they kind of suspected her all along, but they really had no proof. And as the war went on, Bruno Loza became more and more suspicious of her. So did his boss, Kurt von Baer, who's like a Nazi out of central casting with a glass eye and a wolf hair collared coat. Von Baer, at the end of the war, decides that he needs to get rid of her. Liquidate was the term. And he wanted to take her to the border and have her killed, so that she couldn't testify to anything that happened inside the museum. So yes, it was very dangerous, and she would have been executed probably instantly had she been caught.
And it's got to be a horrible irony for you as the author. The thing that kept her alive was that she was so discreet about everything. But it had to drive you nuts when you're trying to get the real nuts and bolts and what's Rose thinking right then. And that stuff there isn't a lot of it.
No, yeah, the research therefore had to be very in-depth and very widespread, because you never know where you might come across information, right? And this is the kind of stuff where I'm not necessarily looking for information that fills a timeline. I want to know, what was Rose thinking? And so it was about tracking down people that might have known her, letters she would have written that people don't know about. And as the course of the writing went on, things would appear. So like, here's a new trove of letters that the family had been holding on to, and now you can see it, that kind of thing. And in other cases, it took many, many rereadings of the things she wrote. It was like I started to understand her style of writing, her way of imparting information. And then realizing, oh, okay, here she's actually being pretty emotional. It's like on first reading, it just sounded like a bunch of facts. But now I'm like, oh, okay, she said it that way. We know now that this was meaningful to her. And so it was that. And then I went through a lot of her drafts for her book, draft reports that she wrote, and found a lot of new things and things that, she edited out in the official version of her story. And so that also was really helpful.
Now, Rose had a boss that just sucked. We already talked about him. She did have another one that was way more helpful, and I don't want to forget about him. Can you talk about him?
Yes. His name is Jacques Jaujard, and he really looked kind of like Humphrey Bogart. He was very slim and handsome and suave. Basically, like everyone in the Louvre and the National Museums of France were gaga over him, and he was a real operator. And so he was in charge of creating the plan to protect all of the art in the Louvre and all the national museums all over France. And he was looking for people who were talented, skilled, hardworking, and Rose fit that bill. And they both came as kind of outsiders. He was from a working class family as well, became a journalist and made his way up from there. And so I think the two of them really understood each other and knew how to focus on what are the important matters, what's the goal at hand. Rose helps to evacuate the Jeu de Paume during both the Munich crisis in 1938 and then when war breaks out in September 1939. And then in October 1940, the Germans ask to take the Jeu de Paume Museum. And at that point, Jacques Jaujard knows he's got the kind of perfect person to spy on what the Germans are going to be doing inside the museum. And so he tasks her to quote, stay at all costs inside the Jeu de Paume Museum. And she takes that directive very seriously.
Now, the Nazis definitely took some art that we have not been able to find ever again. Is there any one that as you're going, you're like, oh my God, if I could lay my eyes on this, that would be the ultimate? Is there one that sticks out in your mind, or is there too many?
There are too many, but one of the secondary storylines I have in my book is about an art dealer named Paul Rosenberg and his family, and they flee France in the invasion of Paris and end up in New York. They were very close friends with Picasso. Picasso lived next door for many years, and there are many portrait paintings and drawings that Picasso did of their family that are missing. And this to me would be amazing to find because it tells a very personal side of Picasso that I think is not really addressed so often. And I'm sure the family would love to discover them.
What is your favorite piece of art? You got to pick one. It can be a statue, it can be a painting, whatever you want. But I mean, you studied this stuff. You have to have one.
I do. It is J.M.W. Turner's, I call it the burning of Parliament, but it's really the burning of the House of Lords and Commons, I think. And it depicts the fire that consumed Parliament. And it shows this event from the opposite side of the Thames. For me, it's the color, it's the agitation of the scene, the drama of it. So you see smoke, you see fire, you see at the very foreground of the painting a whole bunch of people watching the scene happen. And then you see one of the bridges over the Thames on the right side in almost like a pure white. So that counterbalances with the fiery scene going on. And I've loved this painting, I think, since I saw it in high school in my art history book. And then I went tracking it down and realized it's actually in the US, not in England. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I just love the turmoil of that painting.
I think if I had to pick one, because I thought about asking you this question, I better have an answer myself. I think it's actually the Raft of the Medusa.
Ooh,
I think painting. So. There's probably a whole bunch if I thought about it, but I can't say the artist's name. Do you know?
Géricault.
There we go. Yeah.
And I mentioned that painting in the Art Spy because it's one of the big history paintings that were protected and removed from the Louvre during the war. I had to cut some sections about it, sadly, but I can talk about it here. It was a painting that was not necessarily the largest in the Louvre, but because Géricault uses bitumen to make the blacks blacker, bitumen doesn't actually ever fully dry. And so they couldn't roll this painting like the other large paintings. They had to bring it out straight and flat. And so they had to put it onto a scenery trailer that came from the Comédie Française in order to take it out of Paris. And so this whole scene is very dramatic and very theatrical. And I was able to mention parts of that story.
Now, if I could send you back in time so that you could interview one person from the book, it can't be Rose. Rose is too easy an answer. You have to pick somebody else. Who would it be?
I've got two. I would love to meet Jacques Jaujard, Rose's great boss, because he too didn't leave behind a memoir or much papers, despite being a journalist in his prior life. And so he remains one of the other mysteries of this whole story of art protection in World War II and looting and the Nazis. Secondly, I would also love to meet Bruno Lose, Rose's nemesis in the museum. By all accounts, he was fairly terrifying, but also charming when he wanted to be mercurial, chameleon-like. And they hated each other for their whole lives. Rose continued to go after him. He continued to talk about her and attack her till the end of his life. I would just love to really understand the psychology of this. And for every character, I really tried to get down to understanding what motivated them. Even Hitler and even Bruno Lose and even the boss, Henri Verne, that was terrible to Rose. I wanted to understand what would have motivated some of these characters to behave in the way that they did.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother book on some of those psychopaths. But so, Michelle, there are people, poor misguided souls, they don't realize that history is not just a class they took in high school that might have been super boring, right? These books are amazing. So if I sat one of those, again, poor misguided souls, in front of you and they said, I don't like history, why should I read The Art Spy? What would you say?
I would say that there is indeed probably a lot of history writing that is dry and academic, but there's a whole genre, narrative nonfiction, in which the task is to present history like a movie. And when I read these books, and some of my favorite authors like Lynn Olson, Eric Larson, Laura Hillenbrand, you are brought right in there into the scene with the people. You can see it. It's vivid and it's a page turner. And for me, these books are more exciting than fiction. The actual unfolding of events reveals human nature. It's hubris, but also what's amazing about it. And I think by reading real history, you start to understand a lot about ourselves and our society. Sometimes when I read historical fiction, I roll my eyes a bit. I'm like, we didn't need that. Real life and how it unfolded is crazier than fiction a lot of times.
Totally agree, Michelle. Love the book. Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for this episode, Michelle. Thank you so much. The Art Spy. Go out and get it, folks. If I tell you it's good, you know it's good. In the meantime, hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.